To get to your promised land, you are going to have to set out and follow the presence of God. And it is His presence that will lead you to your promised land. Today we are going to be discussing setting out, because when God's presence lifts off of a place, that's when you know it is time to go. And so we are going to be reading in Numbers and learning about how Moses obediently followed the presence of God to lead God's people out of slavery and into their promised land. Numbers 9:15 through 23, it says, "On the day the tabernacle, the tent of covenant law, was set up, the cloud covered it from evening till morning. The cloud above the tabernacle looked like fire." That is how it continued to be. The cloud covered it, and at night it looked like fire. Whenever the cloud lifted from above the tent, the Israelites set out. Whenever the cloud settled, the Israelites encamped. At the Lord's command, the Israelites set out, and at His command, they encamped. As long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they remained in the camp. And when the cloud remained over the tabernacle a long time, the Israelites obeyed the Lord's order and did not set out. Sometimes the cloud was over the tabernacle only a few days. At the Lord's command, they would encamp, and at His command, they would set out. Sometimes the cloud stayed only from evening till morning, and when it lifted in the morning, they set out. Whether by day or by night, whenever the cloud lifted, they set out. Whether the cloud stayed over the tabernacle for 2 days or a month or a year, the Israelites would remain in camp and not set out. But when it lifted, they would set out. At the Lord's command, they encamped, and at the Lord's command, they set out. They obeyed the Lord's order in accordance with His command through Moses. So to catch us up where we are in our reading, the Israelite people's plan of escaping a famine that was in Canaan turned out to be a 400-year struggle of Egyptian slavery that they would have to endure. And Moses arose as their leader to tell Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt at that time, to let God's people go. Pharaoh was hard-hearted and would not. So God sent many plagues upon the land of Egypt, and the last of which was the slaying of Egypt's firstborn sons. So while they were burying their dead sons, God's people were on their way out of Egypt, out of slavery, the day after Passover. God protected all the people who placed blood over their doorposts, and that is why the holy day is called the Passover, because God's judgment passed over the people of Israel. So they were in the wilderness trying to get to the promised land, the land God promised them as an inheritance for generations to come. They had many setbacks because of faithlessness, stiff-necked, hard-hearted people who would at times long to go back to Egypt just to get potted meats. All the while, God was providing for them day and night, providing for them food in the wilderness, manna, which was bread from heaven, and quail. God began to show Himself to Moses and the Israelites as the great I Am. God gave them many instructions on how to live a holy, set-apart life because they were God's people. God would talk directly to Moses, and Moses would bask in the Lord's Shekinah glory. That is His awesome presence, the awesome presence of God that is to be feared and to be reverenced. The presence of God was their ticket to the promised land as long as they continued to follow His presence. So that is the history of where we are in the scriptures for today's lesson. And we're going to look at all the takeaways that we can glean from the reading in the text from Numbers. God's presence is all we need because it is His presence that leads us into all righteousness. It will keep us from sin. It will keep us from wicked fear. It will keep us from the lack of faith. It will keep our feet from slipping. The presence of God produces a righteous fear and reverence, and that righteous fear causes us to worship the great I am, the mighty I am, the Ancient of Days. Exodus 33:9-10 says, as Moses went into the tent, the pillar of cloud would come down and stay at the entrance while the Lord spoke with Moses. Whenever the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance to the tent, they all stood and worshiped, each at the entrance of their tent. The Lord's power is so great that it made the Israelite people tremble. They asked Moses to put a veil over his face when speaking with them after Moses came down from the presence of God. That is how powerful the presence of God is. The presence of God is a humbling, subduing presence. So with the leadership of Moses, the people were instructed to set out and to go where the presence of God led them, because they would eventually reach their promised land. So let's go through a few takeaway lessons that we can glean from the book of Numbers in chapter 9. Lesson point number 1, follow the presence of God. Follow the presence, because it's the presence that's going to lead you to your promised land. We have to follow the presence of God. We have to follow the presence of God in our lives to get where God has ordained us to be. And point number 2, God knows what we need when we need it. I think that it is so special that God gave them what they needed exactly when they needed, and He gave them what they needed to endure the harsh wilderness. He gave them a cloud to cover them by day. This would protect them from the sun while they were in the wilderness. And then He gave them fire by night that would light the way and also keep them out of darkness and keep them warm. So can you see that He was always providing for them exactly what they needed? God is Jehovah Jireh, and Jehovah Jireh means He is our provider. He was the people of Israelites' provider while they were in the wilderness, and so He will be with us. Point number 3, set out when God says go, okay? And then camp out when God says stay. It is so imperative to be where God tells us to be when He tells us to be there, okay? And that leads us to point number 4. Don't go ahead of God and don't get behind God. There is nothing worse than being at the wrong place at the wrong time, or being at the right place at the wrong time. We have to be where God tells us to be when He tells us to be, to do the things that He has required us to do, that He has set forth for us to do. We need to be on God's timing, not our own. And point number 5, don't prolong your wilderness experience in an encampment when you should have set out and follow the cloud. Don't get comfortable setting up a great life in the wilderness or in the land that is not yours. Keep following the presence of God so that you will inherit what God has planned for your life. You don't want to forfeit your inheritance by a small mindset, small thinking, or getting stuck or forgetting the ways, the miraculous ways that God has led you out and has delivered you. You don't want to forget what He has done for you. And guess what? If He did it before, He can do it again. Point number 6. When you are in the wilderness of your life, in which we all will come to a wilderness at some point, follow the cloud, the fire, because it is the presence of God that is going to lead you out of the wilderness and into your promised land. So, seek God's presence for your life, for your next step, for your next move. If you don't know where to go, seek God for your next move. The Spirit of God will always lead you and will always guide you. And the Spirit of God is truth, and He will lead us to the truth of our lives. The truth of our lives will always be His perfect plan and purpose for us. Point number 7, God will cover what is His, okay? There's a saying, if God brought you to it, He will bring you through it. And so I want you to know that if God got you there, He will get you out. If God brought you to it, He will bring you through it. God will cover you. If you keep His commandments, He will send the cloud of His Spirit to cover you while you sojourn and while you set out. He will cover the faithful. He will cover you in every way. He will cover you with clothes and shoes that won't wear out. He will cover you with manna and quail to eat while you set out. So you got to have faith, and you have to believe that he is protecting you. And while you set out, he will tell you how to do it, where to go, and he will cover you. Point number 8. Keep the charge of the Lord at the Lord's command by your God-appointed leader. Numbers 9:23 says, at the Lord's command they encamped, and at the Lord's command they set out. They obeyed the Lord's order in accordance with his command through Moses. So follow your God-appointed leader. That may be your husband, that may be your pastor, that may be the Lord himself at this particular time in your life. But obey the Lord's order through your God-appointed leader and through your God-appointed leadership. It is your duty to test the spirit in which your leader operates. And if you perceive them to be a man or woman of God, by their fruit, because it is their fruit that will show you who they really are, then you should follow them as they follow God. Because you don't want to be like Miriam. And I'm not going to go into all the details of that. I want you to do your studying on what happened to Miriam as she did not follow the presence of God through her God-appointed leader. We want to follow godly leadership, but we first must make sure they are fruitful in that way, that their fruit lines up with the Word of God. And that's our job to make sure of that. Point number 9, get organized in the wilderness. You can't get organized in the promised land. The wilderness is the perfect time to get your life together, to get organized. And in chapter 10 of Numbers, we see the Israelites people, getting organized by their leadership. These people were going from enslavement to the promised land. And you can't go into your promised land with a slave mentality. So to conquer, to take dominion, you have to go with the awareness that you were made to rule and to reign. You were made to be enlarged and to take over the territory that the Lord gave you. So you must do the work. You must get rid of sin. You must get rid of disobedience. And we saw what happened to the older generation of the Israelites. They didn't make it into the promised land. Only the younger generation, 20 years and younger, along with Caleb and Joshua. They're the only ones who made it into the promised land. Not even Moses made it. Because Moses sinned and hit the rock when he was angry. And he hit the rock and water came out of it. And because of that, Moses did not make it into the promised land. But Moses understood what his assignment was to do. And he understood that because of that sin, he wasn't going to make it. But his assignment was to get them ready to take over the land that was theirs. And he fulfilled what God told him to fulfill. He brought them all the way up to the edge of the promised land. He got to see it, but he did not get to enter it. Caleb and Joshua took them into the promised land through the leadership of Caleb and Joshua. He taught God's people the righteous ways. This is Moses. He taught them the law and how to follow it and how to get organized to where they could conquer and take over the land that was promised to them. The wilderness is not just a physical battle. It is a spiritual battle, and you must treat it as such. Sojourning is not just physical, okay? But it is spiritual. And this is how you should know that this is the case. Because a journey that should have only taken some weeks or a month at the most actually lasted 40 years. And that is because of sin and doubt and fear, not the godly fear, the bad fear, and a slave mentality. But Moses, Joshua, and Caleb had to set them in order so that they could get ready to take over what God had promised them. The spiritual battle was about to get really physical because the spiritual battle that they were making it through the wilderness was going to end up turning into a physical battle when they had to take over their inhabitants and the land that was promised to them. So, to expand and to enlarge the borders of your life, to take possession of what God has promised you, you must get organized in your wilderness. And let me state that clearly. You're not building an organization. You are building an army. God's people is an army. We're not building organizations. We're building an army for the Lord. God is building his army up in us. Moses, Joshua, and Caleb was training an army to rule, to reign, and to take dominion of what God had promised them. So build your army, or be a part of the army that God is building up. Be in training to take it by force. You're going to have to take what's yours by force. It's not going to come to you. Take what God gave you and take it by force. You don't have to ask for it. You go get. If God promised it to you, you go get what's yours when God meets you at your appointed time. And the way God meets you at your appointed time is that you have been following the cloud all along. You have to set out when God tells you to set out, and go and take it by force when God tells you. So remember that when we set out, we can't set out on our own. We have to go with the presence, the cloud, the fire of God, taking us to our destination. To get out of our enslavement, we must follow the presence of God. To get to our promised land, we must follow the presence of God. So, dear brother and dear sister, remember, when God says set out, set out. When God says encamp, encamp. But remember to follow the cloud and set out.